Right, this is the last video from me. Just want to discuss a couple of things that perhaps I probably didn't explain as well as possible, or just some areas of confusion. Other than that, good luck tomorrow if I don't see you before your exam. I'm sure you'll all do well, so good luck with it. So first thing, just a couple of random things. This first one was just a mistake that I put in my notes. When you're talking about the Youth Jobs Path, that second step, the internship program, was pointed out to me by that the payment of $1,000 is only $1,000 for the businesses, not $10,000 for the internship payment. So it is $10,000 for if they employ them for over 6 months, but the payment that they receive for taking on the intern for that 12-week period is only $1,000. So if you are using all the figures, make sure you talk about that instead of $10,000. Also, when you're discussing the Beef Roads program, if that's the one you're choosing for external stability, make sure you first call it the $1.2 billion white paper on developing Northern Australia. Technically, that's the the full name of the policy, and then just explain within that policy that there's a Beef Roads program, and then link it to what's involved in the Beef Roads program. But do give it the official title, particularly for a 4-mark question where you're linking one policy to external stability. A couple of other things. When you're linking productive capacity to growth, there's a lot of questions about how productive capacity can help to stimulate growth in the long term. It's really good if you can link that to lower prices and increased international competitiveness. So that idea that boosting our productive capacity allows us to charge lower prices, which should also boost our international competitiveness, which will create additional aggregate demand, and therefore will flow on through increased production and real GDP growth. In terms of demand-side factors, I did touch on this in the last video. Just in terms of, I suppose, really knowing what's going on at the moment, technically the dollar has appreciated slightly over the last 12 months. So if you do get asked for a factor over the last 12 months, I would suggest that make it really clear that you know that the dollar is appreciated. You can still use the lowish dollar as a positive demand-side factor, but I would just say that it's appreciated slightly. Same with commodity prices. Commodity prices are lower than what they were this time last year. So again, you can use it as a negative and then link that to investment spending. But they have rebounded. They have rebounded a little bit in the last couple of months. So there has been some growth in commodity prices recently. If you're worried about the right language to use, I suggest you talk about either the slower growth in China, the low cash rate, or even low company tax rates as your choice of demand-side factor. So if you get the choice and you don't want to sort of go through those problems with the other ones, then link it to one of those 3 goals, because it's a bit maybe easier to articulate in terms of their impact on growth, particularly the lower company tax rates. If you want to, I won't go through this, but this is basically these are just 2 graphs that show you what's been happening with the terms of trade and the value of exports recently. So the value of exports has increased in the last couple of months. That's partly because we're getting slightly higher prices at the moment. But compared to exactly this time last year, they've still fallen. In terms of supply side factors, as I said, lower oil prices and lower wage growth, you can link that through to boosting our productive capacity, and then you can link that to lower unemployment as well, because we're more likely to hire workers because they're making more profits, and wages are cheaper as well. Alright, just going off on a little bit of a tangent here. With external stability, I know we've used the $1.2 billion white paper for the Northern Territory and the Beef Roads as the main policy. This is a really good policy for if you get a question about what the government's doing to try and get us back into surplus. So we've talked about the excise taxes and the changes to super, which can help. But this multinational tax avoidance, there's a quick video that goes for about 2 minutes on this website that I suggest you watch. But this is something you can also talk about for external stability, and it's about making a 40% penalty rate of tax on large multinationals to try and shift their profits offshore. So it's designed to prevent multinational corporations from shifting profits offshore by penalising the higher company tax rate. The idea of this policy is to generate around $650 million over the next 4 years. So that's going to help reduce the size of our budget deficits. But you can also link it to, because we're running smaller budget deficits, less public sector debt, and therefore that can flow onto less net foreign debt, and you can link that to external stability as well. In terms of what it actually means, there's a thing called transfer pricing. That's basically when you try and shift your company taxes, so you start paying company taxes in other countries because it's cheaper. They're trying to stop that. There's also a task force in place on behalf of the ATO to make sure that businesses are complying by all their tax laws that they have to comply with, and that goes for individuals as well. So you can talk about how the government's got a real big effort to make sure that companies and individuals are paying the necessary amount of tax, particularly multinational corporations, and anyone that sort of dobs on their company or whistleblowers basically there's measures to protect those and get in case they want to come forward and basically say that their company's doing something dodgy. This is just another thing that a couple of girls pointed out today to me in class. When you're talking about excise taxes like cigarettes and tobacco and petrol, rather than saying they're regressive taxes, technically a regressive tax means that the low-income earners pay a higher percentage. In this case, they're not paying a high percentage in tax, they're just a higher proportion of their income. So it would be better if you said that these are taxes that can have regressive effects, rather than actually calling them regressive taxes. It shouldn't be a problem either way, but that would just be a better way to go about it. Call them, basically, these are taxes that can have regressive effects on the economy. If you do get a question on the lower terms of trade, I know I'm sort of just saying random things here, but you can link that to lower investment and consumption spending. That causes job losses, lower consumption spending, particularly in other industries because of the multiplier effects, can also hurt growth as well. Right, key thing here, I know I've said this before, but I just wanted to point it out because it's directly from an examiner's report. This is the 2014 report. When you're linking things to strong and sustainable growth through aggregate demand, you've got to mention production in between. So you can see here, if you look at the examiner's report, where it says many students failed to define the goal, that's fine, but then students are tending not to fully develop the economic relationship explanations and linkages. For example, jumping too quickly from a decrease in aggregate demand into a decrease in economic growth. Students might have said that the appreciation means that exports become more expensive, but basically what that bit in the middle is there's people are jumping too quickly from increased aggregate demand to increased economic growth. You've got to map the whole process out and talk about how increased aggregate demand can lead to increased production to meet that demand, which will then flow on to increased economic growth. A couple of things about the budget. Some key terms when discussing the budget and the different goals. So if you get a question about how this year's budget might impact external stability or inflation or so on and so forth, my suggestion is to start with the stance. So talk about what the stance was this year and how that will affect the goal. So for example, for inflation, you could say the more contractionary budget, the smaller deficit or the reduction in the deficit from 39.9 to 37.1 billion means that injections are increasing relative to leakages. That can, means that leakages are increasing relative to injections, which could have some dampening effect on aggregate demand and inflation. And then talk about some policies that you think are relevant for that goal. So you could talk about, for inflation, the National Science and Innovation Agenda, or the lower company tax rates and how that might cause inflation in the short term through increased aggregate demand, but lower it in the long term through increased investment spending and more productivity. I'm still getting a lot of emails about the difference between external debt and government and public sector debt. So again, remembering that a budget deficit means that the government's expenditure exceeds their revenue for a given 12-month period. That will increase government or public sector debt because they've really only got two options. They borrow from the overseas or the private sector. And because public sector debt is the government's debt to everybody, the public sector debt will always increase when we run a budget deficit because they have to borrow from one of those two parties, and both of those will lead to increasing public sector debt. In terms of external debt or foreign debt, the government may choose not to borrow from overseas, so a budget deficit doesn't have to increase external or foreign debt if they decide to borrow from the private market. So budget and foreign debt can increase if we borrow from overseas to fund the deficit. The budget and government or public sector debt will increase as we borrow from either the private or overseas sector. Some people still don't use monetary policy when they get asked for a government demand side policy. It is a government demand side policy. I know it's run by the RBA, but it's on behalf of the government, so it does count. Also, don't say the lower deficit this year will reduce public sector debt. Still a deficit, so it's still contributing to public sector debt, albeit at a lower pace. Alright, micro and macro demand side factors. I think it's been too long since we've looked at some of these micro factors. If you do get a question on name a factor that can impact, demand supply within a particular industry, you can talk the micro factors, things like changes in the price of complements or changes in the price of substitutes and things like that, or demographic changes. So, for example, aging population might reduce the demand for new cars or bikes or scooters or something like that. That's a microeconomic demand side factor, as opposed to macro factors, which are more macro in terms of they affecting the whole economy. So in terms of, there was one question on industry sectors and how like a demand and supply side factor is causing lower growth in the industry sector. So if you chose manufacturing, for example, your demand side factor might be the fact that there's cheaper substitutes from overseas, where your supply side factor might be that wages are higher in Australia than overseas. So really choose really micro factors. If you want to choose, why, the demand in other sectors is increasing at the moment, so say the healthcare sector, your demand side factor could be that there's an ageing population, so a change in demographics, where your supply side factor could be something like the slightly lower wage pressures going on in Australia at the moment would be a good supply side factor. Even though they're higher than overseas, it's still a positive thing for Australia in terms of the slow wage growth.